Hi everyone, welcome to the first of our weekly videos for Political Science Inquiry, Polls 2601. It's a new experiment. Let's see how it goes. I'd appreciate your feedback on the discussion boards via email or whatever method you'd like to try. So what I'm going to do in these videos each week is I'm going to summarize a little bit of the readings and kind of fill in some of the gaps that we might have from discussions that we'd have in our classes. So let's start by saying that I hope that you've already watched and read the materials and in order for this week, which is submodule 1 of the analyzing data section of the class. And so if you haven't already looked through those, let's pause this video now and let's go ahead and have you do that. If you have already, fantastic. Let's continue on. And just a quick note about this too is that when I'm talking about analyzing data, some people may think, oh gosh, we're going to be trying to do statistics in this very short order of time. And that's not what this class is meant to do. We have another class where students can take and will actually do statistical calculations. But in your life, you're going to be a consumer and analyzer of existing data. And so what I want to have you be able to do as part of this section is collect existing data and be able to interpret it, to analyze it. As a good social scientist, one of the key skills that you'll have is the ability to analyze social data. So we're going to go into it with that expectation. And so let's start talking a little bit about the Eastern Michigan Library video on the basics of data. I think it's pretty self-explanatory and hope that you understand that, but I'll take questions on the discussion boards or via email. After you've watched that video, I want you to shift over to the second link, which is the News Media Alliance piece. And you may wonder why I've posted a link that speaks to journalists. That's a good question. There's a method to my seeming madness, though, and that's because much of the information that we consume on a regular basis comes from the news media. So to understand the limits of how data is communicated to us, we should understand the journalistic norms and processes that lead to some of the incomplete communication and analysis of the data that we receive, and that we as social scientists then need to step in and fill in those gaps. So you'll be consuming news for your own consumption and as an opinion elite for your colleagues, friends, family, and you're going to be required to make sense of a lot of data. Probably, and we've even talked about this in some of our in-person sections of the class, is that when you're a poli-sci major or one of the other majors that's close to it, when you go home and you go to family visits or you're meeting with friends, they tend to lean on you and ask you for your advice, your insight into political phenomena that are occurring, and they'll be throwing data your way. One of the things that you'll be expected to do is kind of play Mythbuster with that misleading and sometimes completely erroneous data. So starting where the data comes from, as far as I'm concerned at least, a really good place to start. So I want you to think about opinion polls around a presidential election, for example. We're in the election of 2020 season, of course, and so we're going to be bombarded with polls. And we know that polls can be wrong. 2016 certainly showed us that those polls can be wrong. But as I mentioned to you, a lot of that was really fundamental. It was based on some really inside stuff that we can cover in a public opinion class, but is not necessarily in the scope of what we're doing here in Political Science Inquiry. And even when polls are accurate, they're still incomplete measures. This is kind of the grain of salt with what I want you to take a lot of the political data that you'll consume. Data is important, but so is the context in which it operates and its limitations. So as we think about a poll, if we wanted perfect information and we wanted to absolutely predict who people were going to vote for president, we'd want to survey every eligible voter in the country. But obviously that's more than 150 million people, and that's just infeasible. So we have to take what's called a sample and hope that they represent the entire public. But that sample comes with its own limitations. Sampling means that there's a chance, depending on the size of the sample, how many people get surveyed, that the sample might not be representative, or that there's just a little bit of room to fudge in there, that the predictions aren't said with a complete level of confidence. That confidence is something that we call the margin of error, and any good poll is going to not only report numbers, but it's going to report the margin of error. For instance, when a journalist reports a poll, they'll usually produce a really definitive number. Like they'll say, for instance, Donald Trump is leading Joe Biden in Ohio, 47% to 45%. So we're going to take a timeout right there with those numbers, because those numbers are not something that we should take as canon. The first thing we need to check in those races, especially in those close ones, is what's called the margin of error. It's a measure of uncertainty over those reported numbers, the 47 for Trump and the 45 for Biden. Because what a poll gives us with those specific numbers is the midpoint of a range. There are stretches above and below those numbers that we have confidence the true number lies in between. So let's say that in this hypothetical poll, the margin of error is 4%. And if you're consuming a news poll and it doesn't report the margin of error, don't even take it as a valuable or valid poll. Every poll should be recorded with its margin of error so we can understand how reliable it is. But if we take that idea of a 4-point swing, let's take Trump's 47%. What that poll actually is saying, with a 4% margin of error, is that Trump's actual number could range on the high end all the way up to 51, or the 47 midpoint plus 4, or take away the 4 from the midpoint to take him down to as low as 43. Now, if Trump's actual number is higher, say it's that 51% that I gave you on the high end of the 4% margin of error, then that also means that in a head-to-head race with Joe Biden, that 4% gets taken away from Biden. So his 45% would go down to 41%. But that also means that the opposite could be true. Biden's number could be as high as 49%, which would then force us to take the margin of error of 4 points off of Trump's 47, putting him down to 43. The way the poll was reported, Trump had a slight lead, but it's actually more appropriate to say that the two are tied, because either one of the candidates could be leading. In one of those circumstances, when the margin of error favored Biden, he moved up to 49%, and Trump knocked down to 43. So in some interpretations, Biden could be in the lead, and in other interpretations, Trump could be in the lead. Polls are imperfect measures. Again, we certainly learned that in 2016, but it's important for us to really be cautious in how we interpret polls. I'm going to take you back to the 2000 presidential election and the race between George W. Bush and Al Gore. All throughout the election, the polls between them showed them within the margin of error. It was usually about a 51-49 split, and your typical poll is going to have a 4.5 to 6% margin of error. So clearly we had no idea which one of those two candidates was going to win, which is part of why the electoral margins were so razor thin and why Florida's uncertainty threw the entire election into the court system. But anyone looking at those polls ahead of time should have been able to see that because the polls were within the margin of error, neither candidate ever really had a clear and compelling lead. Functionally, that race was tied, and that was certainly borne out with what we saw on election night. So, as we're thinking about analyzing data, that's us as a consumer. But we're also going to be collecting data to use it for interpretation and for making our arguments and our points. The internet makes collecting data a much easier experience than in times past. But we also need to be careful about our sources, since that data can be as misleading as it is informative. Government agencies and academics are usually the best and most reliable sources for data, but there's lots of publicly available sources on which you can rely. The same criteria for trusting news sources can go along with data sources. Interest groups and other biased organizations may have good data, but it takes investigation, verification, and generally speaking, their inherent biases make using any of their data problematic. That's part of why one of the links that I provided you is the Google Dataset Research link. It's a great resource here. I'll invite you now to pause the video for a second, go to that link, the Google Dataset Research link, and put the words Georgia elections into the search box. You'll get a series of good and reliable data sets from which you can analyze. And the first one should come up from what's called the ICPSR, the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research. This is the same entity at the University of Michigan that provides us the American National Election Study data that we've used before in our class. So you know that it's reliable, it's well vetted. They tend to have very small margins of error because they use strong sampling measures. They are the most accurate and reliable data source on the American electorate that's out there. But you may not want to use electoral data, so there are other options that you'll have. And you'll find that Dataset Research link from Google is really, really helpful in that respect. One other thing that I want to point out in your readings, and that is whether you're able to find quantitative or qualitative data. Much of the work that we're going to do is quantitative, which means we'll be using and analyzing numerical data that can then be adjusted and statistically transformed to identify trends and statistical significance. The link to the Political Science Guide reading includes links to some great sources of quantitative data, but sometimes qualitative data is important too. You can collect quantitative data on, say, how many people will vote for one particular candidate or another, like those polls that we were talking about just a moment ago. But if you want to understand why people prefer one candidate or the other, you'll need to ask more open-ended questions. And that means collecting qualitative data. For rich explanation, qualitative data is great. It just won't tell us about larger trends. For that, we need quantitative data. So as I've said any number of times in class, it's important to use the handyman's creed, the right tool for the right job. Think about the kind of data that you want to collect in terms of what kind of answer you need to put together for your research question. That's going to be the really important piece for you to remember, whether you're using qualitative or quantitative data. Qualitative data can give you that rich explanation, but it takes a lot of time to collect it, accumulate it, clean it, and it's not necessarily reliable. What qualitative data you might get from a few dozen individuals in deep explanation can give you that dive into that piece, but it's not going to tell you what hundreds or thousands of other people might be doing and thinking. That's where quantitative data really, really matters. There's one more link that I want to point you out to, and that's just a reference resource on how to cite data sources in the APA style that we've been using in our class. One last note, I want you to remember that not all data will have to go through complicated transformations. I'm not expecting you to do computations like chi-squareds or ordinal regressions. That's not within the scope of this class. That's not what I expect of you. Sometimes just getting some data that's already put in tables and reporting those results, providing your analysis of what those reported data tables tell us, gives us the story that we need to know. Again, the right tool for the right job holds true here. So we're not going to require you to go out, collect original data, and construct sophisticated statistical analyses. You should be able to identify a data source from which you would analyze figures in your paper and provide a qualitative social scientific analysis of what that data means and what it tells us. That's the really all of the readings that I have for this section of the class. So again, please make sure that you have read all of those sections, all of the readings that I have assigned, and you should be working on your paper draft now. If you want to do your outline, you know that we have that available. I'm making that available to you as an extra credit. You do not have to do it, especially if you're feeling crunched for time. Don't push yourself to do an outline. It's just extra credit. It will not hurt you if you don't do it, but I wanted to give it to you as an option and as an example. We will have our regular Tuesday and Thursday meetings, and hopefully you have signed on to your survey on your internet preparedness, and you've maybe signed up for some one-on-one consultations with myself, with Craig, or with Ann as we prepare for your first draft of your course paper to be due. That's it for now. I hope everyone's doing okay. I haven't heard from a lot of people at the time that I'm recording this, so I hope that everyone feels ready and confident and that you're not having any problems. If you are having any problems, please get a hold of me, Craig, or Ann. We're here to help you, and we want to help you make sure that you have all of the tools that you need to complete this class successfully and walk away with all of the skills that we intended for you to have at the end of the class. So I'm thinking about you all. Hope you're all doing well, and I will see you in the class group meetings on Tuesday.